Hey, welcome. Today we are diving deep into the world of Charles Kingsley, a really fascinating Victorian writer who believed that words were weapons. He didn't just sit down to write entertaining stories, he was writing manifestos. He used novels to fight for social justice and, at the very same time, to build this larger-than-life, heroic vision for his entire nation.
So, that brings us to the central puzzle of Charles Kingsley. How does that even work? This was a man of some pretty intense contradictions. On one hand, you have a passionate reformer fighting tooth and nail against things like child labor. But on the other, you've got this fervent patriot who's cheering on England's growing empire. How did one person manage to be both? Well, let's get into it.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the man himself and what drove him. Then, we'll see how he gave a voice to the voiceless with his protest novels. After that, we'll explore his other side as England's epic storyteller. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the complicated legacy he left behind.
To really get a handle on Kingsley's work, we have to start with his core motivation. You see, everything he wrote, and I mean everything, from children's fantasies to sweeping historical epics, it was all powered by one single, really powerful idea.
Just look at this list. Kingsley was a true Victorian powerhouse. He wasn't just a novelist. He was a respected historian, a clergyman in the Church of England, a super passionate social reformer, and even a keen naturalist. Every single one of these roles fed into his writing, giving it this unique blend of moral purpose and incredible depth.
So the idea that tied all of this together was something called Christian socialism. Now, don't get too hung up on the political sound of that. For Kingsley, this wasn't really about politics as we think of it. It was way simpler. It was about taking the basic Christian principles, compassion, fairness, looking out for your neighbor, and applying them to solve the brutal, real-world problems of industrial England.
And that mission, that core belief, led him directly to his first major novels. This is where he really weaponized his fiction, using it to shine a massive spotlight on the suffering of the working class and expose the injustices they were facing day in and day out.
A perfect example is his novel Alton Locke. This book just throws you right into the grim reality of a working-class tailor who gets swept up in the Chartist movement. And this was a real thing. It was a huge grassroots campaign fighting for basic rights for workers. The book was a raw, unflinching look at just how brutal life could be.
Yep, and that's exactly how people saw it. It was considered a powerful critique. This wasn't just some story to pass the time. No way. It was a political statement. It was an attack on a system that Kingsley believed was just fundamentally unfair and, from his perspective, unchristian.
But here's where Kingsley gets really clever. He could also be much more subtle. He's probably most famous for The Water-Babies. Now, on the surface, it's this utterly charming children's fantasy about a little chimney sweep named Tom who has this magical adventure. But hidden just beneath that fairy tale surface is a blistering critique of one of the worst evils of his time, child labor.
And when you put these two books side by side, it really shows you Kingsley's incredible range. With Alton Locke, he's using gritty, in-your-face realism to get his message across to adults. But with The Water-Babies, he uses a magical moral fable to deliver a similar message to a completely different audience, kids and their parents. Two totally different approaches, but both driven by the exact same moral mission.
Okay, so Kingsley wasn't just a critic of England's problems. That's only half the picture. He was also one of its greatest champions. He became this master storyteller who helped shape the whole Victorian idea of what it even meant to be English.
You can see this perfectly in his most popular novel, Westward Ho. This thing is a full-on, swashbuckling historical adventure set back in the Elizabethan era. We're talking thrilling tales of brave sea captains, epic naval battles against the Spanish Armada. It's just a roaring celebration of English courage, Protestant faith, and, imperial ambition.
And his historical range was just staggering. Look at this. He wasn't just stuck in one period. He jumps back to the 16th century for Westward Ho, then all the way to the 11th century to tell the story of an English hero fighting the Norman invaders, and then clear back to 5th century Alexandria to explore this massive clash between ancient philosophy and early Christianity. For Kingsley, all of history was just part of England's grand story.
And across all these historical adventures, you start to see these common threads emerge. They're all stories about patriotism, about trying to define Englishness. They celebrate heroism, duty, and loyalty. And they're fascinated by these huge clashes of culture and faith that, in Kingsley's mind, were the very things that forged the English nation.
So,
What do we do with a writer this complex today? How do we reconcile the guy fighting for social justice with the guy building national myths? Well, it all comes back to his fundamental belief in the power of the pen.
Kingsley really leaves behind this dual legacy. On one side, he was absolutely a social crusader, using his novels as a megaphone to fight for the marginalized. But at the same time, he was a national storyteller, crafting the heroic myths his country was eager to believe about itself. He was even a bit of a pioneer, subtly weaving Darwin's brand new ideas about evolution into a children's fantasy story.
So here's the bottom line, the most important takeaway from all of this. Charles Kingsley's ultimate contribution was showing the world just how powerful literature could be. He proved that a novel could be so much more than just a story. In his hands, a novel became a sermon on morality, a political pamphlet demanding change, and a history lesson defining a nation's soul, all wrapped up in one.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. Kingsley used the most powerful medium of his day, the novel, to campaign for what he believed in. So what about us? In our world today, what do you think is the most powerful medium for activism? What has the power to really challenge, inspire, and shape our world? Thanks for joining me.